Welcome to the FMCG Guys, the podcast that dives into the innovation, strategy, and trends shaping consumer goods and retail in Europe and beyond.
Hi, Eoin. How are you doing?
I am great. How are you, Daniel?
Very good, very good. Just coming from a weekend here. It's been surprisingly gray for the last few days. The last week has been gray. Today is gray again. So looking forward to the spring to come soon here to Barcelona.
How cold does it get there in Barcelona during the winter?
It doesn't really get cold. Like maybe it goes down to 5 degrees or something like that, but it's just like a couple of weeks.
Yeah. Not too shabby.
Where are you based? Remind me again.
So I'm actually based in Michigan, which does get freakishly cold. But actually, I spend the month of February in Key Largo, which is just south of Miami. So it's lovely down here.
Is
so
that where you are now?
I am. I'm looking out at the Key Largo Sound as we speak.
Fantastic. So look, I brought you to the podcast and thanks for coming as well, because I saw your posts on LinkedIn, which I thought were very insightful about the sports and outdoors industry, like the apparel world, but more on the sporty side. How did you end up doing that? What's your career background?
So I've really been in the outdoor industry for the past 16 or so years, primarily with a company called Moosejaw, which was one of the leading retailers in the outdoor space in the U.S. market. And I joined after private equity had come into the company, and then we built it up and sold it to Walmart, which world's biggest retailer, or I guess until recently, depending on how you count with Amazon. But and then was there, actually ran Walmart's outdoor category on Walmart.com for a few years. Then ultimately Walmart sold us to Dick's Sporting Goods, which is the biggest sporting goods retailer in the US in 23. And then ultimately they folded Moosejaw into their existing outdoor banner, which is called Public Lands. So that happened early last year. And so really for the past 12 months or so, I've been working mainly consulting with emerging brands in the outdoor active space. But, as I sort of got freed of the corporate comms overlords, I started to get much more active on LinkedIn and just sharing thoughts about how different brands were doing, et cetera. And that has really taken off. Got a great following there. And then also I joined a podcast called Rock Fight, which is has become really the leading industry podcast for the outdoor industry in the US. So having a great time, just working with a lot of cool folks. And yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, I'll definitely add your podcast to the show notes if anyone wants to listen in. And basically, it's more like, compared to this podcast, which is really like a different guest in every episode, yours is more like analysis of the industry, right?
That's correct. Yes. So I'm on every Monday. The show is on three times a week, but I'm on every Monday, and we really do a roundup of the news within the outdoor industry and talk about what's going on and give some perspective. So what we found is that a lot of outdoor industry folks just like to get that first thing Monday morning, kind of tune in, be up to date on what the scoop is, so to speak, and then go about their day. So and it drives a lot of interesting conversation.
Yeah, I mean, again, I really liked your posts, so I thought I have to have this guy on the podcast. And my intention really is to understand a bit what's the state of the industry in general. So I have a whole list of companies here that I've written down, and the idea is a bit to talk about more like the sporting area first, and then a bit the outdoors. I saw that you just posted something today about BF and Contour, so we're gonna tackle that one as well. What if you look at the sports outdoor industry? Is there like a general reading you can do of it as a head start?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sporting goods industry has done better in the whole COVID boom bust cycle than outdoor has. So sporting goods obviously had a big rise in terms of athleisure and athletic footwear as people were staying home during the pandemic, but that's really stayed fairly constant. And there's been ups and downs along the way, but there was, as athleisure rose and team sports fell, then once the shutdowns ended, then team sports came back. So sporting goods in general has done relatively well and has held up. Whereas the outdoor industry has really gone through this huge boom and bust cycle to where everybody wanted to get outdoors early in the pandemic. They were out, they were hiking, they were biking, they were kayaking and doing all the things and spending money, buying up, all the bikes and kayaks they could find. And then the industry, ran out of inventory. So bought a whole bunch of stuff, and that arrived late because of all the issues with the transport ocean freight. That arrived late in 2022, just in time for people to, have all those shutdowns ended, and they decided, well, okay, we don't want to buy any more of this stuff. We're going to go and travel and do these things we haven't been able to do for a couple of years. And so the outdoor industry has been working through this major inventory glut for the past 18 to 24 months. And it's been pretty brutal. There's been brands that have shut down, retailers that have gone under. The biggest retailer in the US is called REI. They've had major profitability issues. They've lost $500 million in the last 2 years. So yeah, outdoor has definitely been in a tough spot, tougher than sporting goods.
I think in the pandemic, there was a bit the feeling of like, this trends will last forever kind of thing, no? Like, why did that happen? Like, when you look at it now, in hindsight, everything's easier, right? But it's kind of logical, no? It wouldn't last forever.
Yeah, of course. But, it's sort of typical human feeling that like, oh, well, first of all, when things go well, in business and in life, we tend to attribute that to ourselves and all the things we're doing incorrectly, right? And then when things do poorly, it's human nature to attribute it to the outside world, right? So a lot of these brands that saw these booms during COVID, they didn't just, ascribe it to, oh, this is a one-time blip. They're like, oh, well, finally people are understanding how brilliant we are. This is going to continue forever. And then, when things went south, they're like, oh, well, the market's tanked on us. But it's like, no. You weren't as brilliant as you were at the top, and you're probably not as bad as you look at the bottom. So, it's just, you got to kind of keep that even keel.
Yeah. Well, lessons to be learned there, I think. Let's go into like specific companies, and let's start with the big one in the industry, which is Nike. A very interesting case. I love Nike as like a example of so many things in terms of like brand marketing versus performance, DTC versus wholesale.
Nike really a great brand, certainly. But really the whole D2C thing was just this major misstep. Not only was it a major misstep because they pulled back from their dealers from wholesale, which then opened up shelf space for up-and-coming brands like On Running and HOKA and New Balance and others. So they actually helped their competition there. So not only did they do that, but by focusing so much on D2C and so much of their energy on that piece of the puzzle, they really took their eye off the ball on product, right? Which is ultimately why a brand exists. And this was something that the prior CEO actually came right out and said that, like, we lost our focus on product. And so that is really the struggle right now is, okay, let's go back and try to re-embrace these dealers that we basically told to F off, right? And B, try to get that product engine really going again. And they're finding it hard. They're finding it hard to get that shelf space back because that was hard won by these new brands. And oh, by the way, these retailers in the past, so one retailer in the US is called Foot Locker, one of the leading mall-based players, right? Okay. And so in I think it was in 2020, 70% of their sales was Nike, 70%. And I worked in an industry where when I first joined Moosejaw, the North Face was 45% of our sales, and that was scary. It's like, wow, you do not want to be in that situation where you're so concentrated on a single brand who can basically tell you what to do, right? So at 70%, it's insane. Just way, way, way too much concentration. So Nike's really having a hard time winning back that shelf space, not only because there's a lot more really good competitors on the scene now, but because the retailers are like, we don't want to go back to that. We don't want to go back to being that beholden to a single brand. So yeah, I think they've got tough times ahead.
I was speaking with someone at Foot Locker recently, and they were like happier than Larry for not being so dependent on Nike anymore.
Right. Yeah. And so they don't want to go back to that.
No.
So really Nike is a little bit stuck between a rock and a hard place, because the reality is actually their D2C has to continue to perform, because otherwise their sales are really, really going to be tough from a growth perspective.
And the customer acquisition cost in DTC is normally more expensive as well. So.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I work with a lot of brands, nowadays a lot of brands start out as D2C, and then they're like, oh, well, we don't want to go into wholesale, right? Wholesale, where we're going to give away all that margin to the retailer. Why would we do that? And what I would show them is, well, let's break down all the numbers here. Let's look at how much you're paying to Meta and to Google and to all these other things, how much you're paying for single item consumer fulfillment, yada, yada. And it's like, oh, shit, okay, we can make more money in wholesale, right? Without having to pay all those other things, because of the scale that's involved. And also you can grow much faster if you can get into the right retail accounts.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that this podcast is mainly like CPG, FMCG.
Okay.
If you told an FMCG company to delist themselves of supermarkets and on top of it not invest in marketing, which is actually what they've done, that's their issue, they would think they were crazy. What do you think of the appointment of Elliot Hill? So Nike appointed, for the audience, Elliot Hill, which is a veteran of the company, spent a couple of 3 decades in the company, then left in 2021 or something like that, and brought him back as like bringing the spirit of the company back. But what are your thoughts?
I think he has a tough job ahead of him, quite frankly. And they're even in their latest analyst meeting basically came right out and said that this is going to be harder than we thought, perhaps, in getting these wholesale partners back. Because part of the reason why they brought Elliot back is because he had great relationships with all of these dealers who, quite frankly, were a little bit pissed off that they got treated the way that they did. And so part of the thought process as well, Elliot's we've got these great relationships where he'll sort of, he'll be the salve for that wound. But again, the reality is that retailers really don't want Nike back, even if they love Elliot Hill, right? It's just like, So I think it's the right move for the company. The last CEO who came from the tech industry was a bit of a disaster, but and you never want to count Nike out. But I do think that the recovery is going to be a little bit longer than people had maybe first hoped when he was appointed.
Yeah. Then we have Adidas, which is the big rival, obviously, they hired around 2015 or 2016 Kasper Rorsted, who is a CEO known for being very like sharp on numbers, but not necessarily the best person to build a brand. Then his term as CEO, because in Germany they have like fixed terms, was finished during COVID, like in the peak of COVID. So they decided to renew him, and then they let him go like in the middle of his second term. Where do you see Adidas right now?
They seem to be doing well, at least holding their own. Obviously, the whole Yeezy thing was a bit of a disaster. And, quite frankly, a bit of a self-inflicted wound, because the signs were there that Yee or Kanye or whatever he's going by these days was going to be a problem. And they just let that fester until it just became an absolute open sore. So, but they've actually managed to navigate that quite well, and without it being a complete financial disaster that it could have been. So kudos to them. They're growing quite well. I mean, they've been one of the beneficiaries of Nike pulling back from retail. I think the interesting thing there is that even despite the fact that they grew, double digits last year, they went ahead and laid off up to like 9% of the personnel at their head office. And which, in talking to some insiders, is less about cost savings and more about them really taking much more of a regional approach, because they had taken a very well, I guess what I would call Germanic approach, where everything came from on high and from the headquarters, and they told the regions how to run their businesses. And then I think over time they realized that's not the best way to run the business. Give the regions the latitude to be able to understand the local markets and run the business accordingly. So what ended up happening was they had really these double organizations. They had all these marketing people or brand people, let's say, or whatever in Germany, and then they had all the same people in the US and in Asia, whatever. And so now they're really they're dismantling a lot of the global piece, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, and by the way, they made an interesting CEO choice as well, because they brought in the CEO of Puma, who was ex-Adidas as well. But I think kind of in the same idea as Nike in terms of having somebody really looking after the brand and the spirit of the brand and so on.
Absolutely. And we're seeing, I think, the many more brands that are stepping into this space. And part of my feeling is that, like, you look at the On Running, for example, or HOKA or Brooks or New Balance, or any of these brands that are challenger brands now to the big two being Nike and Adidas. And I think what we're seeing is, consumers in general want something different, and they want a brand that says more about themselves than in the past. And in the past, like, really, if you were Nike, what does it say about you? Because it's so omnipresent. It's like, okay, you're wearing Nike like every other person in the world, right? Whereas if you make the choice to wear On or New Balance or one of these other brands, you're actually saying, I'm a more of a critical thinker about the way about what I put on my feet. And so I do think brand is becoming actually, in some cases, more important to define who you are and what you are around a brand. And I would say even like New Balance has done a masterclass in that with the whole "we got now," right? That whole element of anti-incumbency. And, we're feeling anti-incumbency from a political perspective, right? But it's very much the case from a youth perspective as well, right? They don't want to wear, their dad's Nikes, or their mom's, Adidas or whatever. They want to have something new and different. And so I think the challenge for some of these bigger brands is going to be, how do you overcome anti-incumbency and almost, become a disruptor in an industry that you dominate? So it's and Nike's obviously done some of that, like what they did with some of their Olympics advertising. The question is, can Adidas do the same, or are they just going to lean on like sort of their Sambas and kind of the core styles?
Yeah,
and get out beyond that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like Adidas, I don't know if it's been the same in the US, but in Europe, it's kind of, they feel like the Gazelles and the Sambas, which is getting like, just bringing a very old model back, has been like their lifesaver really in the last year or two.
Right. And the question is, if it's purely trend driven or fashion driven versus performance driven, trends come and go. And if all your eggs are in that basket, what happens when people move on and that's no longer the coolest shoe?
Yeah. Do you think, in terms of like, from what you know, in terms of like innovation, brand and so on, is it a matter of like investment, or is it like more a matter of like leadership and company culture?
I think it's all of the above. But the brand has to invest, right? It has to invest in top of the funnel. And that's part of the challenge with D2C, is that so much of the marketing spend ends up happening at the bottom of the funnel. Google shopping ads or whatever, where you're trying to steal that person that wants to buy that particular brand of Nike or that particular product of Nike. You want to get them instead of them going to Dick's Sporting Goods or whatever. And so you waste a lot of money there. Whereas the brand's role should really be to define the brand at the top of the funnel, generate overall demand for the brand, and tell that story and differentiate the brand from the rest of the company, of the players out there, as opposed to try to just be transactional. And that's I think one of the big issues with D2C is you become transactional and you start doing things that are not brand accretive, like discounting and coupon codes and all these other things that don't help the overall health of the brand, that only focus on just that D2C sale.
Well, when Nike is mentioned as like losing wholesale shelf to the likes of HOKA, for example, on running, specifically HOKA, which is actually part of Decker's brands, which is like this like ugly oversized shoe, but it has this cool element to it. What do you think they've done well?
Well, so HOKA, most people don't remember this, but I remember when I first saw HOKA at trade shows in the US. This would have been in 2012, 2013. And at the time, at least in the US market, minimalist was the thing, right? Everybody had these, super like barefoot running, Vivo barefoot, Five Fingers, all these brands were the thing. And so when you walked down the aisle and you saw these HOKAs, it was like, what the hell is this? They just huge sole. And I, when I first went over to them, I'm like, oh, these things are going to weigh a ton. And then you lift them up and they're like lighter than air. Yeah. And so what kind of alchemy is going on here? These things are amazing. But I think what HOKA has done well, and actually on running as well, is they really lean into what I call visual tech, right? In other words, when you look at that product, it looks comfortable because it's so flippin', the sole is so big. As a consumer, you're just looking and go, oh, okay, I get it. That's going to be comfortable to wear. Likewise with On, with its, open sort of cellular footbed, same kind of thing. People can look at it, I can see how that would be more comfortable than another shoe. And even going back to the early days of Nike, they did other visual tech type things to make it look so that the shoe actually looks comfortable. It's like easy for the consumer to wrap.
Like the Air Camera, for example.
Exactly. And that was a huge piece there was with Nike. So visual tech is really important for consumer products, because you don't want to have to, spend hours explaining to your consumer why something is better than the other thing. If they can just get it right away and go, okay, I get it. And the reality is that a lot of the sales in all of these brands, even though they're supposedly running products, the reality is they're lifestyle products. Most of these products, aren't really being run in, right? People are just wearing these around town, or they're wearing them to walk the dog because they're comfortable. And that's the big driver.
Yeah. And probably with the change of habits that we had during the pandemic, where more people are staying at home. And I think that just here to stay I think it goes in their favor.
Absolutely.
Are HOKA still on the growth path?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Continuing. I want to say that they were up 25% last year, which on top of the big number, they're more than a $1 billion brand now, which is, but Decker has done very well between HOKA and UGG, which was one of their other big brands, really doing quite nicely.
On running is an interesting example. They're a Swiss company, well known in Europe, but then I went to Las Vegas for grocery shop in October. I went to the North Outlet. And the only shop in the North Outlet, and there's a lot of shops that had a line outside, was the On Running shop. What do you think that they've done well, apart from like what you said? They're very unique. But there's a European brand that's really killed it in the US. What do you think have been like the pillars of their success?
I think the first thing is they really did start out with specialty. And that can be a big driver, is to say, hey, listen, we're not going to go after mass right off the bat. We're going to establish ourselves as a real brand, a real running brand. And so that was their lean in, is that they didn't just sell to anybody that came along. They didn't sell to Dick's Sporting Goods for a long time. Really, their initial growth was driven by run specialty and then outdoor specialty. So I think that was key. It was establishing sort of their credibility in the space, and then from there going into more mass and more consumer, and having HOKA back in the day, similar kind of a process, having more segmented distribution to where the specialty people got the special product. And then we have a different product, let's say, for the mass folks. And so I think those can be key as you're driving the company. I think the interesting thing about On is actually that Goldman really the Goldman analysts actually downgraded them for the first time this year, which is like, really? I mean, they grew like 40% last year. Why would you be downgrading them? And basically, I think that the feeling from Goldman is that they are that yes, they're an amazing company, and yes, they're going to continue to grow, but that the current stock price is just way too hot for the opportunity that's ahead of them. I mean, their price to sales ratio is like 6 times sales from their market cap, whereas like an Adidas is less than 2. Okay, and their PE ratio is 130, which Nike is 22. Okay, so they're getting a huge multiple right now. So that's not to say that they're not going to continue to do very well. It's just that they can't possibly continue at the current pace.
Yeah, it is true that you can understand the hype, no? But it's really like,
oh, totally.
But it is the hype at the end of the day, probably, no? Unless they can fulfill an amazing promise. But that's probably not, that really doesn't go in line with their strategy either, no? Yeah.
Right. And I think part of it is also going to be how well can they expand beyond their core, which is their core is running. And obviously they've expanded into tennis, which is good. They have, they're in trail running now, which I think helps. They're getting now more into, train and fitness, gym/train. And that's a way to really get after some of the Nike business. But then where do you go from there? Are we going to see an On basketball shoe? Are we going to see them in the NBA, hiking, and other areas? So, yeah, I think that's going to be the big question: is where do you go from here?
Yeah, or apparel could be one, for example.
Yeah, and they're already getting into the apparel piece, but yes, that could definitely be a growth vector for them.
I know that. What about Brooks? By the way, Brooks Running, which is I think approximately 1 billion sales, part of Berkshire Hathaway, and really I think they're the number one in running, performance running in the US. But they seem to be quiet, but very steady and reliable, no?
Yeah, I would say Brooks is the kind of to what you said is really the purest true running brand, right? They're not as much of a lifestyle brand. They are really a run specialty brand. I mean, we at Moosejaw, we forever tried to get Brooks Running, for their even just for their trail running product into our stores, and they were like, "No, sorry, we don't want your business because we're all about run specialty." And it's like, oh, okay, cool. And I really respect that. It shows some real discipline from the company to say, "This is who we are, and we're all about running, and we're all about run specialty, and we're not willing to kind of sell our soul just for some incremental sales." So, yeah, definitely the core running customer there.
And they're staying true into that strategy.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And well, there's one big player that I think made a lot of noise a few years ago. Now I've gone a bit quiet, which is Under Armour, which is footwear, but a lot of apparel as well, more on the performance side. They seem to, I think they overtook Adidas in US sales during a couple of years. I don't know if that's still the case. What's going on with them?
Well, yeah, they've definitely had a bit of a tough go. So they brought back their founder and CEO Kevin Plank, who left under a bit of a cloud a few years ago because it was just revealed it had a very what we call over here a bro-ish culture. Mm-hmm. So everybody, it was guys, and we were going out drinking in strip clubs and taking out athletes and doing all the things, which is is kind of frowned upon in modern society. And it was a bit of a bro-ish brand, I would say, in general, because it kind of came out of their original product was this compression wear for football players. In fact, Plank actually, I think he played football at the University of Maryland. So. So that was the vibe was, we will protect this house. It was, very kind of man.
Literally
Under Armour. Exactly. That was the whole deal. And in fairness to them, they grew that from that core of this compression base layer product into an international, multi-billion-dollar brand. But, as happens in so many ways, especially when the founder exits, you kind of lose a little bit of the core, and it all becomes about the dollars, and they just kept chasing sales. And they obviously were looking to emulate Nike, because Nike can do no wrong, so they really chased Nike's D2C strategy as well, went hard after that, and ended up basically overproducing and having to discount a ton. And so their retailers started discounting, and they would sell to basically anybody, right? So there was no there was no distribution. They got into every category they could get into. They get into the outdoor category.
Some Under Armours in Aldi or Lidl. Imagine.
Oh boy, really?
Yeah.
Yikes. Yeah. Well, that tells you all you need to know, right? I mean, they're just way too much inventory. So really the focus since Kevin Plank has been back has been more of it's dialing it back, right? It's saying, hey, listen, we overexpanded from an inventory perspective, because once you get to a point with a brand where you're basically bribing your customers to buy the product, you've lost the script. Right. And so, unfortunately, though, most brands don't have the courage, I guess, to say, hey, we got it wrong. We need to dial back. Like Wolverine, for example, Wolverine Worldwide, which owns Merrell and Saucony. We were just talking about that on my other podcast. They actually cut their inventories and cut their sales by like 40%. They said, we're way, way, way over inventoried right now. And so they cut way back, and now they're building back. And I think Under Armour is trying to do the same thing, but they probably needed to take a bigger whack to get a bigger bounce. So they're going through it right now, but they are starting to see margins return. I think sales were down like 5% last year or something like that. So moving in the right direction, but still in a bit of a restructuring mode right now.
And they don't seem to have really cracked international that much.
Yeah, I'm not. Do they have much of a play in Europe?
No, not much. I mean, they have a European office in Amsterdam. I know that they have some local offices here and there. And I think they have some people on the ground in Spain here, but they're still like nowhere compared to like the Nike, Adidas. Puma.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense given how really their background was in American football. Yeah. That it wouldn't have the same ring to it that something like a Nike would, which obviously covers a lot more sports that do well in Europe, like basketball and tennis and running, etc.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I know that there was a time where they invested quite a lot into football, like into soccer in Europe, but I think they have pulled out of that. Let's go to outdoors, no? Because I think that's a space that that's very close to your heart. Do you practice personally a lot of outdoor activities as well?
Not. I mean, I'm a hiker and I'm a camper, but I'm not much of a skier. I kayak, but very casual and recreationally, I would say. I'm not like Mr. Hardcore, North Face of the Eiger type person. No.
Okay. So the big player in the outdoors is North Face, I think, which is part of VF Corp, which also owns Vans, Timberland, bunch of other brands. What's going on there? And I know that you were writing today about VF versus Contour brands. Where do you want to start with this?
Well, I guess we should start with VF. So VF has been through a bit of a challenging time. VF Corp has been really built through acquisition. So they buy all these brands. For a long time, the brands all ran fairly independently. Now they're trying to bring them all together under sort of a corporate mantle. But it's been a tough go over the last few years. Because basically what happened was they spent a lot of money. Like they bought Supreme, which is a big streetwear brand here in the US. They bought them for, I think, $2.1 billion a few years ago. And that was sort of the last straw from a balance sheet perspective, because they did that just at the time that the outdoor industry hit a wall. And so their cash flows dried up. And the balance sheet started to look really bad in terms of debt to equity ratios and those sorts of things, to where late last year, VF Corp was actually downgraded to junk status on their corporate bonds, which is not where you want to be. But I mean, they saw that coming, and so they have new leadership there. I think they've basically replaced every single senior leader in the past 18 to 24 months, and are really trying to turn things around. And I think we're starting to see some success there. Sales have stabilized. Margins are much improved. Debt loads are down, primarily because they sold Supreme at a loss, but that really helped on the balance sheet side of things. But yeah, it's been a bit of a tough go, but I think there is light at the end of the tunnel for VF. But the interesting news of last week was the fact that Contour Brands used to be part of VF, and in 2019, then CEO of VF, Steve Rendell, decided we're going to spin them out because they were these kind of boring-ish denim brands, Wrangler and Lee, which are very kind of American mainstream, inexpensive denim, like they're in Walmart and Kohl's and these sort of mid-tier mass retail places. So they thought, well, they don't really match up with all these cool outdoorsy brands that we have. So we're going to get rid of these guys, spin them out into a separate company, and then by getting rid of them, the market will see how amazing we are at VF Corp, and they can kind of go off and do whatever the hell they want. Well, fast forward to today, and VF Corp, their stock is down more than 2/3 since the spinoff. Meanwhile, Contour Brands stock has more than doubled since the spinoff, and now Contour Brands has come back, and they've made an acquisition of Helly Hansen, which your European listeners will know very well, but major brand, almost $1 billion, right? And is in the outdoor industry and in workwear. And so they will go directly against the VF Corp. And it's definitely a big kind of, it was a good acquisition. It's not like they made it just to kind of stick it in the eye of VF Corp, but they absolutely were loving the fact that they were able to get back at those guys.
Do you think there's a relationship between like the success of these companies, which are like companies that have multiple brands? I think it's not only about the brand. I think it's probably also about the governance and big decision making and so on. Because from what I've heard, VF had quite a bureaucratic, over matrix type of structure. I feel like Contour, Dickers are much more flat organizations.
Yeah, I would agree. And part of the challenge, and I've seen this over and over again with outdoor brands, and really any brands that are more in the sort of the passion pursuit side of things, whether that be outdoor active in general. But as you get further and further away from the founder and what that person really founded the company on, and you get more and more into private equity or corporate structures where the only thing that matters are the dollars, brands can lose their way. And in a scenario like VF Corp, where you had the central VF element of it really trying to exert its dominance over the brands underneath it. So not only had you lost the founders many years before, but then you kind of lost the brand script too. And so they start to lose what made them special. And part of the issue with VF Corp is that actually under Steve Rendell, the prior CEO, he decided, well, let's move everyone to Denver.
Oh yeah.
So they basically disrupted all these brands who were, various places all over the US, and said, no, everyone's moving to Denver. Well, people didn't want to move to Denver. So they lost, literally more than 50% of their employees in that move. And so there was so much institutional knowledge that was lost as part of that process as well. So they're coming out of that, but so many brands seem to miss the human element of all this, and they just look at kind of the dollars and cents, and don't realize that it's the people that ultimately make up the brand and the brand voice that gets out there to consumers.
I think it's one thing to turn a company that has very strong brands and very decentralized from one day to the next, turn it into Procter & Gamble or something like this is a huge, very well working, but a huge bureaucratic machine.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for having centers of excellence and sharing best practices across brands that are part of these conglomerates, etc. But you have to have a core brand ethos and people who really care about the brand and the product, especially. If you're sharing all of that stuff across all these brands, it's just going to get watered down and muddy as to what you actually stand for.
Yeah. Because do you think that like the North Face, which is the biggest brand they have, like it's been like underinvested in, or
from a product development perspective, yeah. It's just it's not super exciting right now. Yeah. And when was the last big product or technology launch that they had? I would argue it's probably Thermoball, and that's a decade ago. I mean, they've had some other things along the way, but it's not as exciting as it once was, and there's just a lot more competition.
What about Columbia, which is like North Face, then the next one is Columbia, no? It's like, you can imagine like the similar products with a different logo.
Yeah, I mean, Columbia plays a little bit of a different game because they're a little bit more of an opening price point, and they're distributed more in mass retail, like Kohl's is one example that has Columbia. So they're not quite as specialty. Yeah, I think it's interesting. They have done well. It's privately held, well, not privately held. It is a public company, but still, a majority of it is really held by the family there, the Boyle family. But debt free. I mean, very well run company, right? And so they've actually done quite well. They've had some of the inventory issues that the rest of the industry has, but they've managed to get through it a little bit better. They've acquired a lot of companies that have done not so well over the years, like Mountain Hardwear, but that's actually starting to come back. So really interesting. And now they're saying that they have a new strategy to really lean into youth, which I think is very much needed in the outdoor space. It's a bit of an aging demographic right now. A lot of 50-something people are the people that are buying these expensive jackets, etc. And so Columbia does offer more of an approachable price point for younger consumers. So that's interesting. And I think from what I'm hearing, that they're actually looking to learn from the success that they've seen in Europe, where they've really leaned into this whole hiking lifestyle in Europe. They want to take that learning, like there's something called Hike Society that they built out of Columbia, UK, which is about literally getting out there and organizing hikes in local communities with local influencers and creators and organizations, and really becoming the hike brand for the US, which it isn't really that today, I would say. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they come up with there.
Yeah, it's a similar strategy to what running, like Brooks and HOKA have done with their running clubs, for example, no?
Exactly. And creating community around hike, because I mean, that's ultimately what it is. And it's very obviously, instead of rather than like getting into a sport that has expensive equipment requirements like camping or backpacking or whatever else, hike, hey, you can pretty much anybody can do it. Get a pair of hiking boots, maybe a Columbia jacket for the rain, and you're off, right? So, I think it could have some play if they really get behind it.
Yeah, interestingly, by the way, Columbia was a place where a lot of former Nike wholesale people went because they're based in the same location, right? When they
exactly, yeah, up in Portland, yeah.
I don't know how well they've done there, but I know that a lot of people went there. So, interesting one as well. What about Wolverine Worldwide? You mentioned them before as like cutting down on their sales on purpose. They have two big brands mainly, which is Merrell on one side, and which is more outdoors, and then Saucony, which is more running but also lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as I said, they really did pull back, and Chris Hufnagel, who's the new CEO there, has really driven that strategy, and quite courageous, to basically say, hey, we're going to slash, but it wasn't working. They had to basically incentivize all these sales. Everything was at a discount. They screwed up the launch of their major franchise in hike, which is the Moab, between the 2 and the 3, whatever. I won't bore your listeners, but basically they had both on the market at the same time, with the Moab being discounted. It just didn't go well. So they're digging out of all of that and really have started to see things turn around. not only from sales have bottomed out, which is a key, and are starting to climb back up again, but margins are up dramatically, just dramatically, and that's the lifeblood of any company, right? Is having the margin and the cash flow, and then with that, they've been able to address their balance sheet issues on the debt front, so they've been able to pay down debt. So I think they're in a position now to where they can start to reinvest and drive some sales. They remain obviously a dominant player in hike for Merrell. They're trying to get more into run specialty, which is interesting. They've been trying to do that for a long time. We'll see how it goes. And then Saucony has also turned the corner, and they're starting to make inroads in terms of some of their run product and really getting some good items going there. So it feels like they're on the upswing after a couple of really tough years.
Yeah, an interesting approach as well, especially being stock listed to do that. Yeah, as you said, I think courageous is the right word.
Well, sometimes you have to have a gun to your head, but because that's where they were to a degree. But another executive might have come in and just tried to kind of keep muscling through at the same sales level, and the market wasn't there to support what they were pumping out.
Yeah, and then finally in the outdoor space, Arc'teryx, part of Amer Sports, which are Amer Sports. I think weren't they Chinese owned, and then they IPO'd.
I know. So they used to be owned. Amer Sports was actually, I think it was Finnish.
Partly Finnish, yeah.
Yeah, right. Back in the day, and they had a number of Wilson and Sunto and quite a few snow and active sports brands. But yeah, they sold to Anta Group, which is a major and a conglomerate of other investors out of China. So that's been a big driver, and actually the Chinese market is a huge driver for Arc'teryx. It's interesting. Arc'teryx is not an inexpensive product, right? I mean, you're looking at $500 for a shell and upwards of $1,000 for an insulated jacket in some cases. So it's really beautiful product. It's one of my personal favorite brands. Of course, I'm not paying full retail, or at least I wasn't. But in China, it's actually even more expensive.
Wow.
So in China, Arc'teryx is viewed as what this is Arc'teryx people talking to me, like we are outdoor luxury.
Like
okay, so exactly that is who they look to as their direct competition in China is Moncler, which you wouldn't think of that in the US market because it's more of an enthusiast brand to a degree. But absolutely, it is the Moncler, and in China is a major brand, and so that's really where they're going. And you look at it with their retail stores, they're getting out of specialty outdoor shops and more into D2C. And you could say, well, hold on, you just said how awful D2C was for Nike. This is just a different play, right? This is the Moncler playbook. It is, we're going to control the retail environment. We're going to control price. We're going to control distribution. We never want to see our product on sale, etc. So yeah, a different play, but they're doing quite well.
It seems like a more mindful play as well, like following where the consumers are rather than pushing the consumer somewhere, no?
Yeah, and also, I mean, let's face it, the luxury buyer has not been as impacted by, the price of eggs, because it's just, okay, gasoline goes up by 50 cents a gallon or whatever, so many euros a liter. They don't really feel that, right? And you can talk about income inequality and all of the evils of the world, but the reality is that those folks are kind of what makes the economic engine run. In fact, I just saw a stat today that the top 10% of incomes in the United States accounts for almost 50% of the consumer spending.
Wow.
So if you're playing at that level, you're a little bit more insulated than if you're trying to play at more of a mass retail level, which is where a lot of these other, footwear brands are.
Yeah, absolutely. You need very big wardrobes though for all that spending, but you can spend a lot of money on one jacket as well. So that's a good point.
If you've got, 5 houses, it's fine. You've got lots of wardrobes.
And since you're doing like consulting, we've seen like a lot of European brands try to make it to the US. I don't know, like Gymshark lately, who I know opened like a whole office. Now they scaled that back. Now they're opening a store in New York. There's probably other brands we can think of that haven't really made it big in the US, although they've tried. What's going on?
I've seen a lot of European brands struggle, quite frankly. And most recently, for example, was Jack Wolfskin, which, obviously big outdoor brand in Europe, especially in Germany, tried to break into the US market for a decade and recently said just gave up and is withdrawing from the market. Yeah, I think a couple of things. First of all, I don't think that European brands quite understand how big the US market is, right? To say we're launching in America would be like saying we're launching in every EU country at exactly the same time, right? That wouldn't make any sense. Like nobody would say, oh, that's how we're going to break into EU. We're going to launch in every single country. Because, 50 states, they are almost like 50 independent countries. It is kind of crazy, but very different markets, different climates, right, for across the country, just a different play. And so that's the first thing.
Personalities as well.
Oh, absolutely. Responding to different things, different activities. It's just, it's not one homogeneous country, right? It truly is a United States. So I think that's the first mistake I see. The other mistake I see quite frequently is to where, the European brand wants to control everything from Europe. And they want to really use the same playbook that they use in Europe in the United States. And it just doesn't work, right? And they also are coming from a market usually where they're relatively dominant and very well known. And so they think that they can do all the same things that they do in that market, and that somehow magically people will respond the same way when they've never heard of this brand. So it just needs a different approach. It needs a much more localized approach, localized both from the sense of choosing a region where you want to get a foothold and expanding from there, but also localized in terms of understanding the market and taking a step back and understanding that nobody knows who the hell you are. Nobody cares who the hell you are. You're not going to be granted anything based upon what you did in Europe. You have to win that customer in the United States. And so that, I think, more and more is the challenge. And I see some brands that do it really well. Fjallraven comes to mind as a brand that's really, really created a foothold here in the US, but they did it by bringing on local talent to really drive that business and really investing in the brand and investing in brand exposure at the very, very top of the funnel, as opposed to just trying to, sell into wholesale when the consumer doesn't know who you are.
Fantastic. Well, look, Eoin, this has been a lot of fun. What's the best way to get in touch with you? I'll leave your LinkedIn profile on the show notes. Also, your Rock Fight podcast as well, if anyone wants to tune in. And I think after listening to this, they'll want more.
Oh, well, thank you. LinkedIn is probably is the best. I'm on LinkedIn a lot. And even if people just want to follow to stay up to date on what's going on in the US outdoor market, and that would be great.
I can only recommend they do that. So thanks a lot, Eoin. Thanks to our audience as well for tuning in. And we'll see you in the next episode of the FMCG, guys.
Thanks, Daniel.